Chapter 6: Meaning, Identity, and the Shape of a Life. How Human Beings Become Themselves Across Time. One of the most remarkable facts about human life is that none of us arrive finished. We enter the world incomplete. Not merely physically incomplete, but psychologically incomplete, socially incomplete, and existentially incomplete. The person we become is not present in full at birth. It emerges gradually, shaped by experience, relationships, choices, opportunities, limitations, accidents, commitments, and time itself. A human life is not a static thing. It is a developmental process. And perhaps one of the most important questions we can ask is this: how does a human being become the particular person they eventually become? The question seems simple, yet beneath it lies much of what people spend their lives trying to understand. Why did my life take this shape? Why did I become this person? Why do some experiences remain central while others fade? What makes a life feel meaningful? What transforms a collection of years into a coherent story? These questions are not separate. They are different expressions of the same deeper inquiry. How do human beings become themselves across time? To answer that question, we must first recognize that identity is not something we possess. Identity is something we construct. Or perhaps more accurately, something we continuously participate in constructing. Many people speak about identity as though it were a hidden object waiting to be discovered somewhere deep inside the self. The language of finding yourself suggests that a fully formed person already exists and merely awaits recognition. Reality appears more complicated than that. Human beings do not simply uncover an identity, they build one. Not all at once, and rarely consciously. A life gradually takes shape through repeated acts of attention, commitment, and participation. The things we care about, the relationships we invest in, the responsibilities we accept, the sacrifices we make, and the stories we tell ourselves all contribute to the person we become. Identity emerges from living. This becomes easier to see when we look backward. Most people can recognize earlier versions of themselves that no longer fully exist. The adolescent who worried about fitting in. The young adult chasing achievement. The parent learning responsibility. The grieving person navigating loss. The individual standing at a crossroads, uncertain about what comes next. Each version was real, yet none was final. Life keeps moving, and so do we. The self is not a monument, it is a process. This realization can be both unsettling and liberating. Unsettling because it means there is no final point at which development ends. No moment when we become permanently complete. Liberating because it means we are not confined forever by earlier versions of ourselves. Human beings retain the capacity for revision, the capacity for growth, the capacity for becoming, and this capacity is deeply connected to the stories we live inside. Long before psychologists began speaking about narrative identity, human beings understood intuitively that lives are experienced as stories. Not because life literally follows a script, but because consciousness naturally organizes experience into narrative. We remember beginnings and endings. We search for causes and consequences. We connect events into patterns. We ask what something meant and how it changed us. We do not merely experience life, we interpret it. This interpretation matters. The same event can occupy very different places within two different stories. A failure can become evidence of inadequacy or the beginning of resilience. A loss can become a source of bitterness or a source of wisdom. A difficult childhood can become a prison or a chapter in a larger narrative of growth. What changes is not always the event itself. What changes is the meaning assigned to it. This does not imply that meaning is arbitrary, nor does it suggest that reality can be rewritten at will. Rather, it points toward an important truth. Human beings do not live only in the world, they live in their interpretation of the world. The stories we tell ourselves influence what we notice, what we value, what we fear, what we pursue, and ultimately who we become. Yet this raises another question. If meaning matters so much, where does meaning come from? This question has occupied philosophers, theologians, psychologists, and ordinary people for centuries. Entire traditions have emerged around the search for meaning. And yet many modern discussions begin with an assumption that may be slightly misleading. They assume meaning is something hidden, something waiting to be found, something concealed somewhere beneath the surface of life. But meaning often seems to emerge differently than that. Meaning appears less like a treasure waiting to be discovered and more like a reality that emerges through participation. People rarely find meaning while searching for meaning itself. They find it while caring about something, building something, loving someone, serving something larger than themselves. Creating, teaching, learning, protecting, contributing. Meaning often arrives indirectly. It emerges as a consequence of engagement. This insight appeared repeatedly in the work of Viktor Frankl. Having endured extraordinary suffering, Frankl observed that meaning is not primarily a matter of comfort or happiness. It emerges through responsibility, purpose, relationship, and the way a person responds to circumstances they cannot fully control. Life asks something of us, and meaning often emerges in our response. This understanding changes the nature of the search. The question becomes less, what is the meaning of life? And more, what is life asking of me now? The shift is subtle, yet it transforms the conversation. Meaning ceases to be a hidden answer. It becomes an ongoing relationship with reality. Of course, reality is not always kind. No honest account of human becoming can ignore suffering. Sooner or later, every life encounters disappointment, failure, illness, uncertainty, grief, limitation, and loss. These experiences are not exceptions to life, they are part of life. This can be difficult to accept because much of modern culture quietly promotes an alternative vision. A vision in which fulfillment arrives through the elimination of difficulty. A vision in which suffering is viewed primarily as a problem to be solved. Yet many of the qualities people admire most, wisdom, compassion, resilience, patience, perspective, often emerge through engagement with difficulty rather than avoidance of it. This does not make suffering good, nor should suffering be romanticized. Pain remains painful. Loss remains loss. Grief remains grief. But suffering frequently becomes one of the forces through which human beings are transformed. It interrupts assumptions. It challenges identities. It reveals priorities. It exposes illusions. It forces deeper questions. The person who emerges afterward is often not the same person who entered. This is one reason developmental psychologists, such as Erik Erikson, viewed life as a series of unfolding stages rather than a static condition. At different points in life, different questions become central. Early life revolves around trust. Later comes identity, then intimacy, then contribution, then reflection. Each stage presents its own developmental challenges and opportunities. The details vary from person to person, but the larger pattern remains recognizable. Human beings do not face the same questions at 20 that they face at 50, nor the same questions at 50 that they face at 80. Life unfolds, the terrain changes, and we change with it. This developmental perspective introduces an important form of humility. Many of the questions that feel permanent are actually seasonal. Many of the struggles that dominate one period of life become less central later. And many of the insights that seem obvious in retrospect could only have been learned by living through the experiences that produced them. Wisdom often arrives slowly, not because reality is hiding, but because some truths require time. Looking back across decades, people often discover that a life possesses a shape that was invisible while living it. Patterns emerge. Themes emerge. Certain relationships become central. Certain commitments define entire eras. Choices accumulate. Habits accumulate. Values accumulate. And gradually a life becomes recognizable as a coherent whole. Not perfectly coherent, but coherent enough. The shape of a life is rarely created through a single decision. More often it emerges through thousands of small decisions repeated across time. Where attention goes, what responsibilities are accepted, which relationships are nurtured, which values are practiced, what sacrifices are made, who is loved, what is forgiven, what is pursued, what is released. The architecture of a life is built gradually, one day at a time, often without realizing it. And then, eventually, a person looks back and sees the shape that has emerged. This perspective suggests that Perhaps the most important question is not, who am I? But, who am I becoming? The first question implies a fixed answer. The second recognizes an unfolding process. Human beings are not static entities possessing identities. They are developmental beings becoming identities across time. And perhaps this brings us to the deepest insight of all. A life is not ultimately understood through a definition. It is understood through a response. We spend years asking questions. What matters? Who am I? What should I do? What is the purpose of all this? These questions matter, but eventually life itself becomes the answer. Not because certainty arrives, not because ambiguity disappears, but because a life takes shape through attention, through commitment, through love, through suffering, through responsibility, through participation, through time. In the end, meaning is not something we possess. It is something we live. Identity is not something we discover. It is something we become. And the shape of a life is not determined by a single moment of insight, but by the countless choices through which a human being gradually answers the question of what to do with the years they have been given. Life asks the question, our living becomes the answer.